A silver coin the size of a thumbnail sits behind glass in a museum case, worn nearly smooth by 2,000 years of hands before it had reached that case. Cut into its face is a woman's profile. A hooked nose, a strong jaw, a diadem knotted at the back of her skull. It looks nothing like the face later poets and painters would invent for her, and that gap between the coin and the legend is where this story actually lives. She was born into a dynasty that had ruled Egypt in Greek, spoken almost no Egyptian, and owed Rome money it could not repay. She would end that dynasty as the last of it, and the only Ptolemy in 3 centuries to speak the language of the people she ruled. In between, she would ally herself with 2 of the most powerful men Rome ever produced, lose a kingdom, win it back, and lose it again for good. This is the story of what it took to keep an old, wealthy, weakening kingdom independent for 1 generation longer than it had any right to survive, and what it cost when that finally ran out. In the royal quarter of Alexandria, a child is being tutored in a language none of her ancestors bothered to learn. For nearly 300 years the Ptolemies, a dynasty descended from one of Alexander the Great's own generals, had ruled Egypt in Greek, from a Greek city, surrounded by Greek courtiers, treating the Egyptian language the way a landlord treats a tenant's dialect, useful for giving orders beneath learning properly. Cleopatra, born around 69 BC, would break that pattern. Ancient writers later marvelled that she could address foreign envoys in their own tongues without an interpreter, and that she was the first of her line recorded as fluent in Egyptian, the language of the priests, the farmers, and the temples that still anchored the country's oldest loyalties. It was not sentiment, it was a survival skill in a family that had stopped being able to survive on bloodline alone. Her father, Ptolemy XII, carried a mocking nickname among his own subjects, Olets, the flute player, for a man more comfortable with music and drink than with governing a kingdom that Rome had grown strong enough to swallow whole. Egypt under Auletes was rich on paper, its Nile floodplain still the most productive farmland in the Mediterranean world, its capital still home to the Great Library and the lighthouse called the Pharos that ships used to find the harbour from miles out at sea. But the kingdom's independence rested entirely on Rome's forbearance, and forbearance had a price. Auletes borrowed heavily from Roman financiers to buy Rome's recognition of his rule, a recognition he needed because his own people despised him, and Rome's Senate could depose a client king with a single vote. The debts piled up faster than the harvests could pay them off. When Rome annexed the neighbouring island of Cyprus, ruled by his own brother, without lifting a finger to stop it, Alexandria's mob rose against Auletes for failing to defend Ptolemaic territory. He fled the city by night and sailed for Rome to beg for reinstatement, leaving his kingdom in the hands of his eldest daughter, Berenice IV, who was crowned in his place. Cleopatra, still a girl of perhaps 11, watched her father run rather than fight, and watched her older sister seize the throne he left behind. It was an early, blunt lesson in how thin the line was between ruling Egypt and merely being allowed to. Auletes spent years in Rome, bribing senators, currying favour with anyone who might march an army east on his behalf, and eventually found his man. A Roman governor named Aulus Gabinius paid an enormous sum to invade Egypt and restore him by force. Roman legions crossed the border, defeated Berenice's forces, and put Auletes back on his own throne at the point of foreign spears, a humiliation the Alexandrian court would not soon forgive him for. Berenice was executed on her father's order. Cleopatra, now approaching her teenage years, had watched her father lose his throne, flee, buy it back with Roman soldiers, and kill his own daughter to secure it. Whatever illusions she might have held about the throne being safe, or about family loyalty guaranteeing anything ended there. A garrison of Roman soldiers, the men Gabinius left behind to guarantee Auletes stayed in power, remained camped in Alexandria for years afterward, a permanent reminder that the Ptolemaic crown now rested on Roman patience rather than Ptolemaic strength. Cleopatra grew up inside that reality, a palace of genuine wealth and genuine culture, home to scholars and a library that was still, even in decline, the greatest single collection of texts in the ancient world, sitting inside a kingdom that could no longer defend its own borders or its own succession without asking Rome first. She was educated as a Ptolemaic princess was meant to be, in rhetoric, philosophy, and the Greek classics, but she also absorbed something her tutors never intended to teach directly, that the throne of Egypt, however grand its palace or however deep its treasury, now survived only by choosing its Roman friends correctly. Her father died in 51 BC, when Cleopatra was about 18. His will, deposited for safekeeping with the Roman Senate itself, because he trusted his own court no further than he trusted his own family, named Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, as joint rulers, expected by Ptolemaic custom to also marry each other to keep the bloodline unbroken. It was a will written by a man who understood exactly how little his own dynasty's word was worth without Rome behind it, and it handed his daughter a throne she would have to defend not against foreign armies first, but against the eunuch advisors and court factions clustered around her own brother, who saw an 18-year-old girl as an obstacle to be managed rather than a queen to be obeyed. For the first 2 years of the joint reign, the official documents tell an odd story on their own. Royal decrees from Alexandria list Cleopatra's name and regnal number ahead of her brother's, an arrangement almost unheard of for a Ptolemaic queen paired with a king, even a boy king barely into his teens. It suggests a young woman moving quickly to establish that she, not the 10-year-old at her side, was the one actually ruling. It also guaranteed her enemies at court, and she had no shortage of them. Ptolemy XIII was a minor in the care of 3 men who had no intention of sharing power with his sister a moment longer than they had to. A eunuch chamberlain named Pothinos, who ran the palace's finances and access to the boy king, a general named Achilles, who commanded what remained of Egypt's army, heavy with the descendants of that Roman garrison Gabinius had left behind years earlier, and a tutor named Theodotus, brought in to shape the boy's education and in practice his politics. The kingdom Cleopatra was fighting to control was also in these years a kingdom in genuine physical trouble. The Nile's annual flood, the single event on which Egypt's entire agricultural output depended, failed to rise properly in successive years around 48 BC, a documented low-flood crisis recorded on temple inscriptions of the period. A weak flood meant a weak harvest. A weak harvest meant grain shortages and rising prices in a capital city that already had a well-earned reputation for turning against unpopular rulers in the streets. Cleopatra, trying to govern through both a famine and a court determined to sideline her, found her position eroding on 2 fronts at once, one written in the water level of a river, and one written in the ambitions of 3 men who controlled her brother. By late summer of 48 BC, the regents around Ptolemy XIII had manoeuvred Cleopatra out of Alexandria entirely. The precise sequence is not recorded in enough detail to reconstruct day by day, but the outcome is clear. Within a year of her father's death, the queen who had put her own name first on royal decrees was no longer welcome in her own capital. She fled east, out of Egypt and across the border into the Roman province of Syria, taking with her whatever loyal household and resources she could gather on short notice. It was, on the surface, exactly what had happened to her father a decade earlier, and to her sister before that, a Ptolemy chased from Alexandria by rivals inside the family's own court. Cleopatra, watching that pattern repeat itself around her for the 3rd time in her short life, did not intend to let it end the same way. From her exile in Syria, she began doing what her father had done in Rome years before, only faster and closer to home, raising an army. Syria in this period had a large population of settled soldiers and mercenaries, veterans of decades of Roman and local wars, men available to any patron with money and a plausible cause. Cleopatra recruited among them, gathered a force, and marched it toward Egypt's eastern border, aiming to retake by arms what the regents had taken from her by intrigue. By the winter of 48 to 47 BC, her army had reached the fortress town of Ascalon, on the coastal road that any invasion of Egypt from the east had to pass through, and stood facing an army loyal to her brother's regents on the Egyptian side of the frontier. A civil war between an 18-year-old exiled queen and a court controlling a boy king was, in isolation, a purely Egyptian problem, the kind of succession dispute the Mediterranean world had watched play out inside the Ptolemaic family for generations without much outside interest. But 48 BC was not an isolated year in the wider Roman world. Rome itself had been at war with itself for months, as 2 of its most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, fought for control of the Roman state in a civil war that had already dragged half the eastern Mediterranean into taking sides. In August of that year, at a battlefield in Greece called Pharsalus, Caesar crushed Pompey's much larger army in a matter of hours. Pompey, defeated and desperate, fled the field with a small group of followers and began looking for somewhere to regroup, somewhere with resources, a fleet and rulers who owed him old favours. He looked toward Egypt, toward the very throne now split between a queen camped at its border and a boy king's regents holding the capital, and set his ships on a course for Alexandria. Pompey's ships dropped anchor off the Egyptian coast near Alexandria in late September of 48 BC, and he sent word ashore asking for the hospitality Egypt's rulers owed him, having once helped restore Cleopatra's own father to his throne years earlier. It was, by any ordinary standard of the era's politics, a reasonable request. A defeated Roman general asking an allied kingdom for shelter and support to rebuild. The regents controlling the young Ptolemy XIII debated the request with a cold arithmetic that had nothing to do with old debts of gratitude. Caesar, the victor of Pharsalus, was the man now in a position to decide Egypt's fate, and Caesar was already known to be pursuing Pompey across the eastern Mediterranean. Sheltering Pompey risked making an enemy of the most powerful man in the Roman world at the exact moment Egypt could least afford one. Pothinos and Achilles made their decision. A small boat was sent out to Pompey's ship, its occupants inviting him ashore under the appearance of welcome. As Pompey stepped onto the sand, watched by his wife and son still aboard the ship offshore, he was cut down by men acting under the regent's orders. His head was severed and preserved, evidently intended as a gift to present to Caesar when he arrived, a grim proof that Egypt had already dealt with his rival before Caesar's own soldiers had to. His body was left where it fell. It was, even by the standards of Roman civil war, an act calculated to purchase safety through brutal expedients, and it badly misjudged the man it was meant to please. Caesar reached Alexandria days later, in early October, still pursuing Pompey, and was presented with the severed head as the trophy the regents assumed he wanted. Ancient sources describe his reaction as genuine horror rather than gratitude. Whatever Caesar's ambitions toward Pompey as a defeated rival, the manner of his death, murdered by treacherous foreign courtiers rather than fallen in honest battle, offended the code by which Roman aristocrats were supposed to treat one another, even enemies. Caesar had Pompey's ashes returned to his widow and, more consequentially, for the regents who thought they had bought his favour, took the killing as a pretext to insert himself directly into Egypt's internal politics, rather than simply passing through. Caesar occupied the royal palace quarter of Alexandria with a modest force, nowhere near large enough to control a city as vast and volatile as the Egyptian capital, and summoned both Ptolemy XIII and his exiled sister to appear before him so that he, as the ranking Roman authority now present in Egypt, could arbitrate their father's will and settle the succession himself. It was an extraordinary intervention. A Roman general with barely a few thousand men at his back inside a city of hundreds of thousands, declaring himself the judge of who would sit on the Egyptian throne. Ptolemy XIII's regents, still holding the capital and the boy king, had no intention of letting an exiled queen simply walk back into power, because a Roman general said so, and began quietly preparing their own response, gathering the army under Achilles that had been holding the border against Cleopatra, and turning its attention instead toward the palace where Caesar now sat. Cleopatra, camped with her own army at Ascalon on the eastern frontier, received the summons and understood immediately what it meant. Caesar was, for the moment, the single most powerful man alive, and he was sitting inside her own capital, with the fate of her throne apparently in his hands. Travelling there with an army at her back would have looked like exactly the kind of aggression Caesar's presence was meant to referee against. She needed to reach him directly, privately and persuasively, without her brother's regents or their army intercepting her first. What she chose to do next, arriving inside her own occupied palace almost unnoticed, would become one of the most repeated stories of her entire life and one of the hardest to separate from later embellishment. By most accounts drawn from the Roman biographer Plutarch, writing more than a century after the events, Cleopatra crossed back into Alexandria not by any public route her brother's soldiers might watch for, but by a small boat that slipped into the harbour after dark, and she was carried into the palace concealed in bedding or rolled fabric, small enough of a party to pass unnoticed through halls her own brother's men were guarding. The specific staging of the story, a queen smuggled past guards inside her own home to reach a foreign general, may owe something to a biographer's taste for a memorable scene, and the sources disagree on exact detail, but the underlying fact they agree on is plain enough. Cleopatra reached Caesar directly and privately, without her brother's regents managing the meeting, and by whatever means, it worked. She had an audience with the most powerful man in the Roman world before her rivals even knew she had left the frontier. What passed between them in that first meeting is not recorded in any detail worth trusting, but the outcome is not in doubt. Caesar backed Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and within days Parthenos and Achilles understood that the Roman arbitrator they had hoped to win over with Pompey's head had instead sided against them. Achilles marched his army, tens of thousands of men including the old Roman garrison troops left behind years earlier by Gabinius, into Alexandria itself, and Caesar, with his own far smaller force, found himself under siege inside the palace quarter of a hostile capital. What followed, over roughly 6 months of fighting through the winter of 48 into 47 BC, became known to Roman history as the Alexandrian War. The fighting spread through the city's harbour district, where Caesar's men fought to control the causeway leading out to the Pharos lighthouse, and the fleet anchored beneath it, understanding that whoever held the harbour controlled Alexandria's lifeline to reinforcement by sea. In the course of that fighting, a fire broke out among warehouses and ships near the docks, a blaze that ancient accounts describe as spreading into buildings close to the waterfront. Later writers, centuries removed from the event, would come to claim that this fire consumed the great library of Alexandria itself, and that Caesar was therefore responsible for destroying the ancient world's greatest collection of texts. The library's actual decline was gradual, unfolding across centuries through a combination of neglect, subsequent conflicts, and shifting patronage, not a single afternoon's fire at the docks. What burned in 48 BC, if it touched book collections at all, was almost certainly limited to warehouse stock near the harbour, rather than the library's main holdings, which most modern historians place elsewhere in the city and believe survived for generations afterward. The neat, dramatic story of one Roman general burning the library in an afternoon is a later simplification of a much messier, slower unravelling. During the siege, Ptolemy XIII's youngest sister, Arsinoe, escaped the palace and joined Achillas' besieging army, where she was promptly declared queen by the soldiers, a rival claimant even within her own brother's faction, and shortly afterward had Achilles himself killed in an internal power struggle among the besiegers, replacing him with a general of her own choosing. The chaos on the besieging side, 3 factions now competing for control of a single army, gave Caesar the room he needed to hold out until reinforcements he had summoned from Syria and Asia Minor finally reached Egypt in the spring of 47 BC. With fresh troops, Caesar broke the siege and forced Ptolemy XIII's remaining army to battle near the Nile. The young king's forces were routed, and Ptolemy XIII himself drowned in the river while attempting to flee by boat, weighed down, according to ancient accounts, by golden armour he had worn into the retreat. He was about 13 or 14 years old. Cleopatra, now roughly 21, was restored to the throne of Egypt by the same Roman general who had only months earlier arrived planning simply to arbitrate a succession dispute, and instead fought a 6-month war to secure it for her personally. Ptolemaic custom required a co-ruler rather than a sole queen, so her remaining younger brother Ptolemy XIV, a boy of about 11, was installed beside her as nominal king, a formality that satisfied tradition while leaving actual power entirely in Cleopatra's hands, backed now by the one force in the Mediterranean capable of guaranteeing it: Caesar's own legions and Caesar's own favour. Caesar remained in Egypt for several more weeks after the Nile battle, and by most accounts, in that time he and Cleopatra became lovers, though the sources describing their relationship were written decades later by Roman authors, with their own reasons to shape the story one way or another. What is far better attested is the child. In the summer of 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son she named Ptolemy Caesar, a name that made an explicit political claim that this boy was Julius Caesar's own son, and therefore a living link between the Ptolemaic throne and the most powerful family in Rome. The court, and eventually most of Alexandria, simply called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar himself never formally acknowledged the boy as his son under Roman law, an acknowledgement that carried enormous political weight, and that Caesar, already navigating a delicate position in Rome, chose not to make. But he did not deny it either, and the ambiguity itself became a kind of political asset for Cleopatra, a claim she could press even without formal Roman recognition behind it. Caesar left Egypt in the summer of 47 BC to deal with the remaining fronts of Rome's civil war, campaigns that took him through Asia Minor, North Africa, and eventually Spain, mopping up the last resistance from Pompey's former allies. Cleopatra, meanwhile, consolidated her own rule in Alexandria, a task made considerably easier by the presence of several Roman legions Caesar left behind under a garrison commander, ostensibly to protect the young co-monarchs, but in practice ensuring no rival faction could repeat the kind of siege that had trapped Caesar himself months earlier. Her nominal co-ruler, the young Ptolemy XIV, remained a figurehead with no real authority, and her sister Arsinoe, the rival queen briefly proclaimed during the Alexandrian War, was captured by Caesar's forces and sent to Rome as a prisoner. Removed from Egypt entirely and no longer a threat to the throne, at least for the time being. In 46 BC, with Caesar now installed in Rome as dictator following his victories, Cleopatra travelled there herself, bringing Caesarion, and remained in the city, by most reconstructions, for close to 2 years. It was an unprecedented spectacle for Rome, a foreign queen ruling in her own right, resident in the capital, as the acknowledged companion of the man who governed the Roman state. Her young son, publicly understood by many Romans, whatever the legal ambiguity, to be Caesar's child. Caesar had a golden statue of Cleopatra installed in the temple he built to Venus Genetrix, the goddess he claimed as an ancestor of his own family line, placing the Egyptian queen's image inside one of Rome's most prominent new religious monuments, associated with divinity and with Caesar's own claimed lineage at once. The reaction among Rome's political class ranged from fascination to open hostility. Roman senators, already deeply uneasy about Caesar's accumulation of personal power and the increasingly monarchical trappings surrounding his rule, treated the presence of a foreign queen at his side and the whispered possibility that Caesar might one day legitimize her son as an heir as confirmation of their worst fears, that Caesar intended to make himself something closer to an Eastern-style king than a Roman magistrate, with a foreign consort and a half-foreign heir to match. The Roman statesman Cicero, in surviving letters, records his personal distaste for Cleopatra with real bitterness, evidence of how deeply her presence in the city had unsettled at least one prominent Roman observer, whatever the exaggerations later writers piled on top of it. Cleopatra remained in Rome through Caesar's dictatorship, watching him consolidate power that many senators believed was drifting toward permanent, hereditary rule, an arrangement that would have suited her own dynastic interests perfectly, tying Egypt's future to a Roman monarchy with her own son somewhere in its line of succession. It was, from her position, the strongest bet available: attach Egypt's fortunes to the single most powerful man in the Roman world and let his power protect her throne indefinitely. On the 15th of March 44 BC, that bet collapsed in the space of a single morning, in a meeting hall attached to a Roman theatre, where a group of senators who saw Caesar's ambitions as exactly the threat to the republic they feared cut him down with 24 or more knife wounds. Cleopatra, still in Rome with her young son, suddenly found herself a foreign queen with no protector, in a city that had just proven it was willing to murder even the most powerful man in it, rather than let him become a king. Cleopatra left Rome within weeks of Caesar's assassination, sailing back to Alexandria with Caesarion, now a toddler of about 3, and no clear sense of which faction in Rome's fresh civil war would end up in a position to threaten or protect her kingdom. The city she had left behind was already splitting into armed camps. Caesar's adopted heir, a 19-year-old named Octavian, claimed his inheritance and his name. 2 of Caesar's own lieutenants, Mark Antony and a general named Lepidus, controlled legions of their own, and the assassins themselves, led by Brutus and Cassius, had fled east to raise armies in the provinces, the same provinces bordering Egypt. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra moved quickly to remove the one obstacle still standing between her and unshared control of the throne. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, had spent the past 3 years as a co-ruler in name only, a boy with no army, no faction, and no real path to power so long as Cleopatra and her Roman allies controlled the state. He died in 44 BC, at around 13 years old, and by most accounts from later Roman sources, he was poisoned quietly and deliberately on Cleopatra's own order. The sources for this are not eyewitness accounts and carry the usual bias of writers hostile to her memory. But the timing, a healthy young co-ruler dying just as his sister needed him gone in order to elevate her infant son in his place, has convinced most historians that the accusation, whatever its exact details, points to something real. Caesarion, not yet 4 years old, was declared co-ruler in his place, a symbolic elevation that changed nothing about who actually governed Egypt, but that mattered enormously for the claim it made: a living son of Julius Caesar, seated on the Egyptian throne, at the exact moment Caesar's Roman heirs were fighting each other for control of Rome itself. As the Roman civil war escalated through 43 and 42 BC, both sides sought Egyptian support, and Cleopatra found herself courted and threatened by factions on either side of a conflict she had every reason to want no part of. Cassius, Commanding forces in Syria demanded ships and grain from Egypt, and when a Roman governor loyal to the assassins tried to seize Egyptian territory outright, Cleopatra's own naval forces resisted him, a rare instance of her kingdom taking direct military action in this period. She also attempted to send a fleet to support Octavian and Antony's side against the assassins, but according to several ancient accounts, the ships were caught in a storm and badly damaged before they could reach the fighting, sparing Cleopatra from having to commit fully to a war whose outcome was still genuinely uncertain. Whether the storm was purely bad luck or a convenient explanation offered after the fact, for a fleet that never much wanted to sail into a Roman civil war on Egypt's own dime, the practical result was the same. Cleopatra avoided placing all of Egypt's resources behind either faction until the outcome became clearer. That outcome arrived in October of 42 BC, at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, where the combined armies of Antony and Octavian crushed the forces of Brutus and Cassius, both of whom died in the aftermath, ending the immediate threat from Caesar's assassins, and leaving Antony and Octavian as the two dominant men in the Roman world, dividing its territory between them under an arrangement known as the Second Triumvirate, alongside the increasingly marginal Lepidus. Antony took charge of Rome's eastern provinces, the half of the Roman world that bordered Egypt directly, and depended on Egyptian grain and Egyptian money to fund the legions he still needed to pay. For Cleopatra, the outcome at Philippi answered the question she had spent 2 years avoiding. Which Roman faction would end up controlling her kingdom's fate? It was Antony, a man Caesar had trusted enough to leave in command of Rome itself during the dictatorship, a soldier with a formidable reputation and crucially direct authority now over every Roman territory that touched Egypt's borders. In the summer of 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, a city on the southern coast of Asia Minor, ostensibly to answer for her hesitant, ambiguous support during the war against Brutus and Cassius. It was on paper a queen being called to account by a Roman authority who could depose her with a word. Cleopatra had learned exactly how to answer a summons like that. Rather than travel overland to Tarsus as a summoned subject might be expected to, Cleopatra sailed there by sea, arriving aboard a river barge that ancient sources describe as fitted with silver oars and purple sails, an entrance built for spectacle rather than for haste. According to Plutarch, she staged herself for the meeting as the goddess Aphrodite, receiving the god Dionysus, dressed and lit for the part, an image calculated for a Roman general already fond of associating himself with Dionysian imagery in his own self-presentation. Whether every detail of the account is precise, the underlying strategy is unmistakable. Cleopatra arrived at a meeting meant to put her on the defensive and instead controlled its entire staging, forcing Antony to come to her rather than the reverse, and framing the encounter in terms of myth and divinity rather than a subordinate's apology. Antony had every practical reason to want an alliance with Egypt, regardless of how the meeting went. He was preparing a major campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, a war that would require enormous sums of money and grain to supply an army that might need to operate far from any Roman supply line for years. Egypt, whatever its political turbulence, remained the wealthiest kingdom bordering the eastern Mediterranean, its Nile harvests still capable of feeding armies that no other client state in the region could match. Cleopatra, for her part, needed exactly what she had needed from Caesar, a Roman patron powerful enough to guarantee her throne against both foreign threat and internal rivals, at a moment when her own dynasty had no army capable of defending itself without one. The alliance that formed at Tarsus was transactional in its foundations, and by most accounts became personal almost immediately afterward. Antony returned with Cleopatra to Alexandria that same year, choosing to winter there rather than in any Roman territory, a decision that already scandalized observers back in Rome, where a Roman commander spending the cold months in a foreign queen's palace, rather than attending to Roman business, read as a dereliction at best and, to his political rivals, as evidence that Egypt's queen had captured a Roman general, the way old stories warned that Eastern courts always tried to. Antony's decision also carried real strategic logic that his critics preferred not to dwell on. Wintering in Alexandria let him begin negotiating and organizing the resources he would need for the Parthian campaign directly from the source, without waiting for supplies to be shipped and requisitioned through slower official channels. While in Alexandria that winter, Antony and Cleopatra by most accounts formed a genuine personal relationship on top of the political one, joining in the elaborate court entertainments the Ptolemaic dynasty was famous for, including a loose society of courtiers and friends who called themselves, with a certain self-aware extravagance, the inimitable livers, dedicated to lavish feasting and amusement. It would be a mistake to read the surviving anecdotes about that winter, drawn largely from hostile later sources, eager to paint both figures as decadent, as a full record of what the alliance actually accomplished politically. Beneath the feasting, Antony was securing Egyptian resources for a war he could not fund from Roman treasuries alone, and Cleopatra was securing for a second time a direct personal tie to the single most powerful Roman with authority over her kingdom's fate. Antony departed Alexandria in the spring of 40 BC to attend to Roman affairs elsewhere, including a political crisis back in Italy that required his presence, and did not return to Egypt for several years. Cleopatra, left behind once again, gave birth later that year to twins, a son and a daughter whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, Sun and Moon, names that reach back deliberately toward the conquests of Alexander the Great himself and staked, in the naming of two infants, a claim on a legacy far larger than Egypt alone. Antony, meanwhile, in Rome's tangled political arrangements of the period, married Octavian's sister Octavia that same year, a match designed to cement the fragile peace between the two triumvirs rather than any personal preference, leaving Cleopatra, once again a Roman ally's Egyptian partner rather than his acknowledged wife, waiting to see how long the arrangement in Rome would last before Antony's attention and his legions turned east again. Antony's marriage to Octavia held the peace between the triumvirs for a few years, but by 37 BC the political marriage had produced little beyond a temporary truce, and the Parthian campaign Antony had been preparing since Tarsus could no longer wait. He needed Cleopatra's resources far more urgently than he needed Octavius' family connection to Octavian, and in that year he travelled east again, meeting Cleopatra at Antioch in Syria, where the two, by most accounts, formalized their relationship through an Egyptian marriage ceremony, a union with no standing whatsoever under Roman law, since Antony remained legally married to Octavia back in Italy, but one that carried full weight within the Ptolemaic court and gave their existing children, and the ones still to come, a recognized status as Antony's offspring in Egyptian eyes. Cleopatra committed enormous Egyptian resources to Antony's Parthian invasion, funding troops, supplying grain, and providing the wealth needed to hire additional soldiers for a campaign that would ultimately field roughly 100,000 men, one of the largest Roman military operations of the era. In return, Antony made territorial grants that expanded Ptolemaic Egypt's nominal borders further than they had reached in generations, restoring to Cleopatra's control regions along the eastern Mediterranean coast, in Phoenicia and parts of Cilicia, along with the copper-rich island of Cyprus, territory that had been lost to direct Roman administration for decades. It was Rome's most powerful eastern authority effectively rebuilding a version of the old Ptolemaic Empire and handing it back to its queen, a striking reversal of the decline her father had presided over. The Parthian campaign itself, launched in 36 BC, went badly. Antony's army pushed deep into Parthian and allied Median territory, but a large baggage train and siege equipment, sent separately and inadequately guarded, was ambushed and destroyed, crippling the invasion's ability to besiege fortified cities. Winter set in before Antony could achieve a decisive result, and he was forced into a grueling retreat through hostile territory, harassed constantly by Parthian cavalry in conditions that Roman accounts compare to some of the worst retreats in the army's history. Antony reportedly lost a substantial fraction of his forces to combat, exposure, and disease before finally reaching friendly territory on the Syrian coast, where Cleopatra met the retreating army with supplies, money, and clothing for troops who had marched out of the mountains in rags. The rescue at the coast, whatever comfort it brought Antony's exhausted soldiers, was read very differently back in Rome. Octavian's allies, and increasingly Octavian himself, seized on the failed campaign, and Antony's continued dependence on Egyptian money as proof that Rome's own general had effectively become a client of a foreign queen rather than the reverse. Propaganda that painted Cleopatra not merely as an ally but as a foreign enchantress who had captured a great Roman soldier and was now through him angling to rule Rome's eastern territories, or worse, to turn her influence toward Rome itself. The charge exaggerated Cleopatra's actual leverage considerably, since Antony needed her resources for entirely practical military reasons that had nothing to do with enchantment, but exaggeration was precisely the propaganda's purpose. Octavian, consolidating his own power in the western half of the Roman world through these same years, found in Cleopatra a useful foreign villain, a figure whose supposed corruption of Antony could justify, eventually, a war against his own fellow triumvir without it looking like a naked grab for sole power. Through 35 and 34 BC, Antony attempted a smaller, partially successful campaign against the kingdom of Armenia, a Parthian ally, capturing its king and bringing him back to Alexandria in chains, along with treasure and captives, in a triumphal procession staged not in Rome, where a victorious Roman general's triumph traditionally belonged, but in the streets of Cleopatra's own capital, with Antony and Cleopatra seated together on golden thrones to receive it. Holding a Roman triumph, or something that looked unmistakably like one, in a foreign city for a foreign queen, was an open provocation to Roman sensibilities that Antony's rivals in the Senate did not let pass unremarked. It set the stage for a ceremony the following year that would go even further, and that Octavian would use, more than any other single event, to justify open war. In late 34 BC, in a ceremony staged in Alexandria before a great gathering of the city, and seated on a raised silver platform with Cleopatra beside him on a golden throne, Antony made a series of formal grants that Roman writers afterward called the donations of Alexandria. Caesarion, now about 13, was declared King of Kings, and Cleopatra herself Queen of Kings, titles that echoed the language of the old Persian and Hellenistic monarchies rather than anything in Rome's own political vocabulary. Alexander Helios, one of the 6-year-old twins, was granted nominal rule over Armenia, Media, and territories reaching toward Parthia. His twin sister Cleopatra Selene was granted Cyrenaica and parts of Libya, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, a younger son born to Antony and Cleopatra around 36 BC, and only about 2 years old at the ceremony, was granted Syria and territories across Asia Minor. None of these children would ever actually rule the territories named for them in any practical sense, and several of the lands granted were not even under Antony's direct control to give away. But the ceremony's political content was never really about administrative reality. It was a declaration staged in front of witnesses and reported swiftly to Rome that Antony intended a Roman-Egyptian dynasty, descended jointly from himself and Cleopatra, to inherit and govern the entire eastern half of the known world. Octavian could not have asked for a more useful piece of propaganda if he had written the ceremony himself. Here was a Roman triumvir, dressed and enthroned in the manner of an Eastern king rather than a Roman magistrate, distributing Roman territory to children by a foreign queen, as though the Roman Republic's provinces were his personal property to bequeath. Octavian circulated word of the ceremony throughout Italy, framing it as confirmation of everything his propaganda had been suggesting for years. That Antony had gone native, abandoned Roman values, and fallen entirely under the influence of a foreign queen who intended, through Antony and their children, to eventually rule Rome itself. The rupture between the two triumvirs, papered over for years through Octavia's marriage and repeated fragile truces, finally broke apart completely in 32 BC. Antony formally divorced Octavia that year, removing the last diplomatic tie holding the second triumvirate together and making his union with Cleopatra his only recognized partnership, at least in the eyes of the eastern territories he governed. Octavian, in response, took an extraordinary and legally dubious step. He seized Antony's will, deposited for safekeeping with the Vestal Virgins in Rome according to Roman custom, and had its contents read aloud before the Senate. The will reportedly confirmed the eastern land grants to Antony and Cleopatra's children, and, most damaging of all to Antony's reputation, requested that he be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria rather than in Rome, even if he died in Roman territory. Whether the document Octavian produced was genuine in every detail, or edited and exaggerated for maximum effect, cannot be established with confidence from the surviving sources, and violating the sanctity of a deposited will was itself a serious breach that some senators found troubling. But the political damage to Antony was done regardless of the will's exact authenticity, because it confirmed, in Antony's own supposed words, precisely the fear Octavian had been cultivating for years, that Antony intended to be buried an Egyptian, not a Roman. The Roman Senate, under Octavian's direction, took the highly unusual step of declaring war not on Antony, still a sitting Roman magistrate whom the Senate was reluctant to name an enemy of the state outright, but on Cleopatra alone, framing the coming conflict as a defensive war against a foreign queen's ambitions rather than a Roman civil war between two citizens, a legal fiction that let Antony's own remaining allies in Italy avoid the appearance of taking up arms against their own countrymen. It fooled no one about the war's real target, but it gave Octavian a cleaner narrative to fight under. Not Roman against Roman, but Rome against Egypt, a framing that would define how the coming conflict was remembered for centuries afterward, even though the man commanding the opposing fleet was as Roman as Octavian himself. Through the winter of 32 into 31 BC, both sides converted years of accumulated wealth and territory into the largest concentration of military force either had ever commanded. Antony, drawing on the resources of Egypt and the eastern provinces under his control, assembled a fleet historians estimate at somewhere between 230 and 500 warships, many of them large vessels built for the Egyptian navy with reinforced hulls and multiple banks of oars, crewed and supplied substantially through Cleopatra's treasury, alongside a land army that most reconstructions place at roughly 70 to 100,000 infantry and cavalry, drawn from Roman legions loyal to Antony and allied client kings across the eastern Mediterranean who owed him military service. Cleopatra herself accompanied the campaign in person, bringing a war chest and a squadron of Egyptian ships under her own command, an unusual and, to Roman sensibilities, deeply unsettling arrangement. A foreign queen present at the front of a war that Rome's own Senate had declared specifically against her. Antony's advisors were divided on strategy from the outset. Some argued for meeting Octavian's forces in a decisive land battle in Greece or Macedonia, where Antony's larger and more experienced infantry might overwhelm Octavian's army before it could be reinforced. Others, likely including Cleopatra herself, favoured relying on naval strength, where the Egyptian fleet's larger ships gave a clear material advantage, and where a strong navy could also guarantee the supply lines and, crucially, the escape routes that a purely land-based strategy could not. The final positioning of Antony's forces, camped along the western coast of Greece near a gulf called Ambracia, with the fleet stationed at its mouth near a promontory called Actium, reflects a compromise between these camps that satisfied neither fully and left the army and navy dependent on each other for supply, in a location that, as the months wore on, proved to have serious disadvantages. Octavian, commanding a smaller total force but a more experienced fleet under his admiral Marcus Agrippa, one of the most capable naval commanders Rome ever produced, positioned his forces to blockade Antony's fleet inside the Gulf rather than seek an immediate confrontation, cutting off Antony's supply lines by sea and forcing his much larger combined force to survive on increasingly scarce local resources through the spring and summer of 31 BC. Malaria and other diseases, common in the marshy coastal terrain, spread through Antony's camp over these months, weakening an army that had begun the campaign with real numerical advantages. Desertions mounted as morale collapsed under the strain of the blockade, including, in a blow that damaged Antony's credibility badly, several client kings and at least one senior Roman commander who defected to Octavian's side, bringing with them intelligence about Antony's dispositions and plans. By late summer, with supplies dwindling and disease thinning the ranks, Antony's war council settled on the only decisive equine left, an attempt to break out of the blockade by sea, engaging Agrippa's fleet directly in the hope of forcing a path through to open water, from which the surviving ships could either turn the tide of the campaign or, if the battle went badly, at least preserve enough of the fleet and its treasury to fight another day. Cleopatra's own squadron of about 60 ships, carrying, according to several ancient accounts, a substantial portion of the campaign's war chest, was stationed toward the rear of the formation, a position that some ancient writers interpreted afterward as evidence she intended from the start to flee rather than fight, and that others read simply as sound tactical placement for the fleet's most valuable and vulnerable vessels. Whichever interpretation is closer to what Cleopatra actually intended, on the morning of the 10th of September 31 BC, the combined fleet rowed out of the Gulf toward Agrippa's waiting ships, and the war that had been building for years came down, in the end, to a single afternoon on open water off a Greek headland called Actium. The battle that decided the fate of Antony and Cleopatra's alliance, and of the entire eastern Mediterranean, began in the late morning and unfolded across several hours of manoeuvring and close fighting between the heavier, more heavily armoured ships of Antony's fleet and the lighter, faster, better crewed vessels under Agrippa's command. Agrippa's ships, smaller but more manoeuvrable, avoided close engagement with Antony's larger vessels where possible, using speed and coordinated attacks to isolate individual ships from the main formation, a tactic that steadily eroded, Antony's numerical advantage as the fighting stretched on through the afternoon without either side achieving a clear breakthrough. At some point in the early afternoon, as the two fleets remained locked in a grinding, inconclusive engagement, Cleopatra's squadron of roughly 60 ships, stationed behind the main line, raised sail and moved out of the battle, passing through a gap that had opened in the fighting and heading south toward open water. Ancient sources, uniformly hostile to Cleopatra and written by authors working within the propaganda tradition, Octavian himself had cultivated for years, described this as a panicked flight that shattered morale and doomed the battle. Modern historians treat the account with considerable caution. A coordinated squadron of 60 ships raising sail together and threading a gap in the enemy line is not obviously the behaviour of a fleet in chaotic rout, and it may equally represent a deliberate decision, whether taken before the battle or in the middle of it, to preserve Cleopatra's ships, her treasury, and the option of continuing the war another way rather than risking everything on a single afternoon's naval engagement that was, by that point, going nowhere decisive for either side. What is not in serious dispute is what Antony did next. Sighting Cleopatra's ships breaking away, he transferred from his own flagship to a smaller vessel and followed her squadron out of the battle, abandoning the fleet and the tens of thousands of soldiers still fighting or standing by on land, leaving his own forces without their commander in the middle of an unresolved engagement. Whatever calculation, romantic, strategic, or some combination the sources cannot fully separate, led Antony to that decision. Its effect on his remaining forces was immediate and catastrophic. Without their commander, the rest of Antony's fleet, already worn down by hours of fighting, began to break apart under continued pressure from Agrippa's ships. Many vessels were burned or sunk, others surrendered outright once it became clear Antony himself had left the field. The land army camped near Actium, still numbering in the tens of thousands, held its position for several days after the naval defeat, apparently unaware at first of the scale of what had happened at sea, or hoping Antony might yet return with reinforcements. When it became clear no relief was coming, and with the same diseases and dwindling supplies that had plagued the camp all summer, still grinding away at the army's strength, the legions surrendered en masse to Octavian's forces rather than face annihilation for a cause their own commander had apparently already abandoned. Octavian, in a display of the same calculated moderation he applied throughout the campaign, to build his own reputation as a restorer of order rather than a mere conqueror, absorbed the surrendered legions into his own forces rather than punishing them, gaining tens of thousands of additional experienced troops in the process without further bloodshed. Antony and Cleopatra, meanwhile, sailed for Egypt with the surviving ships of her squadron, reaching Alexandria in the following weeks with the core of their personal fortune and a shrinking fraction of the force they had commanded only months earlier. The war for the eastern Mediterranean had, in the space of a single afternoon, off a Greek headland, effectively already been decided. What remained was the much slower, much darker process of Octavian, following them home to finish it. The months following Actium gave Antony and Cleopatra a brief, strange interval in which the war was clearly lost in the broader Mediterranean, but Egypt itself remained, for the time being, untouched and still theirs. Cleopatra, arriving back in Alexandria ahead of the news of the full scale of the defeat, moved quickly and ruthlessly to secure her own position at home, reportedly having several prominent Egyptian nobles executed on suspicion of disloyalty, or of planning to defect once word of Actium spread, a signal that whatever had happened at sea, the Queen still intended to rule with a firm hand for as long as she could. She and Antony also explored, according to several ancient sources, the possibility of transporting their remaining fleet and treasury overland across the isthmus near the Red Sea, escaping to some distant territory, perhaps in the Arabian Peninsula or even farther east beyond Octavian's reach entirely. The plan, if it was ever seriously attempted rather than merely discussed, failed when local Arab forces or Roman allied troops in the region burned the ships being hauled across the isthmus, closing off the one escape route that might have let Cleopatra's dynasty survive somewhere else, even if it could not survive in Egypt. Octavian spent the year following Actium consolidating his political position in Rome and the wider Mediterranean before finally moving against Egypt directly, marching his forces east through Syria and Judea in the spring of 30 BC, while a second force under a subordinate advanced from the west, through territory Antony had once controlled but that now, city by city, submitted to Octavian without a fight rather than face a hopeless siege on behalf of a cause that had already collapsed everywhere else. By midsummer, Octavian's combined forces reached the outskirts of Alexandria itself, the city where Cleopatra had been born, crowned, besieged, and restored twice already in her lifetime, now facing its final and most dangerous threat yet. Antony attempted a last engagement outside the city, a cavalry skirmish that went briefly in his favour, enough to raise a flicker of hope, but any momentum collapsed the following day when what remained of his fleet and much of his remaining army offered terms by Octavian's agents, or simply recognising the war as unwinnable, defected without fighting. Antony, watching the last of his forces abandon him without a battle, reportedly believed Cleopatra herself had betrayed him, arranging the surrender to save her own life at his expense, a suspicion the ancient sources repeat without being able to confirm. Whether or not that suspicion was justified, Cleopatra, according to Plutarch, had by this point withdrawn into her mausoleum, a fortified structure attached to a temple near the palace that she had built years earlier and stocked with a portion of her treasury along with a small number of attendants, and sent word to Antony, whether by accident or design, that she had already died. Believing Cleopatra dead and his cause entirely lost, Antony fell on his own sword, a soldier's death chosen over capture, in keeping with the code by which Roman commanders of his generation preferred to end their own lives rather than be paraded as a captive through an enemy's triumph. He did not die immediately. Badly wounded, he learned that Cleopatra was in fact still alive inside the mausoleum, and was carried to her, dying in her arms shortly afterward, according to the account Plutarch pieced together from sources close to the events, inside a structure whose doors, on Cleopatra's own orders, had been sealed and could not be opened to let his body or her attendants pass freely, forcing his final removal to be conducted by hoisting him up through a window with ropes and cloth. Cleopatra, now the last ruler of an independent Egypt with the man who had been her protector for a decade dead in front of her, and Octavian's forces already inside the city, had by most accounts only days left to decide how her own story and her dynasty's would end. Octavian took possession of Alexandria within days of Antony's death, and Cleopatra, still inside her sealed mausoleum with her treasury and a handful of attendants, found herself the last piece of the war still to be settled. Octavian's soldiers gained entry to the building, by most accounts through a ladder placed against an upper window rather than through the barred doors, and took Cleopatra into custody before she could carry out an apparent attempt to end her own life with a dagger, an attempt several ancient sources describe her making the moment she realized soldiers had breached the mausoleum. Octavian, whatever his ultimate intentions toward her, needed her alive, at least for the moment. She still knew where a substantial portion of the Ptolemaic treasury was hidden, and Octavian's own soldiers and the Roman treasury back home badly needed the money a captured Egyptian fortune could provide after years of expensive civil war. What followed was a tense, weeks-long negotiation between a captured queen with almost no remaining leverage and a conqueror who held every advantage but still wanted something from her cooperatively rather than by force. Cleopatra reportedly pleaded for her children's futures, particularly for Caesarion, now about 17 and, in the eyes of anyone still loyal to the old order, a legitimate claimant to both the Egyptian throne and, through his disputed paternity, some shadow of a claim on Caesar's own legacy. Octavian gave vague, non-committal assurances about her children's safety without making any binding promise, a pattern of behaviour that historians reading the negotiation afterward have generally interpreted as Octavian keeping Cleopatra cooperative and calm for as long as he needed her, while never actually intending to let either her or her eldest son survive long enough to become a future problem. The detail that appears to have convinced Cleopatra her fate was already decided reached her, according to Plutarch, through a sympathetic member of Octavian's own household, or entourage, who warned her that Octavian intended to have her transported to Rome, and displayed as the central captive in a triumphal procession through the city, paraded in chains before the crowds that had cheered every Roman general's triumph for centuries, a humiliation reserved for defeated enemy monarchs and one that Cleopatra, who had spent her entire adult life insisting on being treated as a reigning queen rather than a subject or a prize, would not accept under any circumstances. Whether Octavian genuinely planned such a display, or whether the warning was itself a piece of theatre intended to provoke exactly the response it produced, historians cannot say with certainty. Either way, it achieved its apparent purpose. On a day in early August of 30 BC, having secured a final audience with Octavian in which she reportedly negotiated one last request, that she and Antony be buried together. Cleopatra returned to her mausoleum with a small number of attendants and arranged her own death, dressed, according to the ancient accounts, in her full royal regalia, the diadem and the ceremonial dress of a reigning pharaoh rather than a prisoner. The traditional account, repeated by Plutarch and other ancient writers, holds that she died from the bite of an asp, a venomous snake smuggled into the mausoleum concealed in a basket of figs, a story vivid enough to have shaped nearly every later depiction of her death, but one that no ancient source claims to have witnessed directly, and that several ancient physicians and modern toxicologists have questioned on practical grounds, since a snake bite reliable enough to kill quickly and painlessly, as the accounts describe, is difficult to arrange with any certainty. Some ancient writers themselves record alternative explanations, current even in antiquity, including the possibility of a poisoned pin or a prepared toxin taken by mouth. What every account agrees on is the outcome. By the time Octavian's men broke into the sealed room, Cleopatra was dead, along with 2 of her attendants, and whatever method she used, it left no visible wound the Roman soldiers who found her considered worth describing in any detail beyond 2 faint marks on her arm. Octavian, by most accounts, was genuinely displeased when his soldiers reported finding Cleopatra already dead, having wanted her alive for his triumph and for the political value of a living, subdued former queen paraded through Rome as proof of his victory. What he received instead was a final act of authority from a woman who had spent her entire reign insisting on setting the terms of her own political life, denying him, in the last hours available to her, the one piece of theatre he had wanted most. Whatever Octavian's private feelings, he honoured the request Cleopatra had made in their last meeting, and had her body embalmed and buried beside Antony's in a tomb near the Temple of Isis in Alexandria, a resting place that has never been located by archaeologists despite extensive searching, its exact site lost sometime in the centuries after her death, likely to earthquakes, rising water tables, and the slow rebuilding of the city on top of its own ruins. Caesarion, sent away from Alexandria before the city fell, apparently in an attempt to smuggle him to safety in the direction of India or the Red Sea coast, was captured, brought back and executed on Octavian's order within weeks of his mother's death, 17 years old. Octavian is reported to have justified the killing with a grim piece of wordplay attributed to one of his advisors, that it was not good to have too many Caesars, eliminating the one remaining rival who could claim, however contested the paternity, direct descent from Julius Caesar himself. Cleopatra and Antony's other surviving children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene and the younger son Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared and taken to Rome, where they were raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's former Roman wife, the same woman he had set aside years earlier to marry Cleopatra by Egyptian rite. Cleopatra Selene alone survived to adulthood. She was later married to a client king and ruled as Queen of Mauritania in North Africa, carrying a faint, diminished echo of her mother's throne into the following generation, her own children eventually forgotten by history in the record that survives. Egypt itself was annexed as a Roman province within weeks of Cleopatra's death, its administration handed to a Roman prefect appointed directly by Octavian, rather than governed as a client kingdom under any local dynasty, ending nearly 300 years of Ptolemaic rule and folding the wealthiest kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean directly into Roman territory for the first time since Alexander's conquests had created it. The grain that had once fed Alexandria's own population and funded the ambitions of a line of Greek-speaking pharaohs now flowed, in enormous quantities, toward the city of Rome itself, helping to feed and steady the very state that had just extinguished the dynasty that grew it. Octavian returned to Rome, and within a few years transformed the Republic's institutions into something new, taking the name Augustus and becoming, in practice if never quite in official title, the first emperor of Rome, his victory over Cleopatra one of the founding stories of the new order he built. What Cleopatra had actually accomplished, across nearly 3 decades on a throne inherited at 18 from a father who had fled his own capital, was neither the caricature later centuries made of her, nor a simple triumph. She had kept Egypt independent for a generation longer than its finances, or its military could have managed on their own, by attaching her kingdom's fortunes, in turn, to 2 of the most powerful men Rome ever produced, extracting protection, territory, and time in exchange for money and armies neither Caesar nor Antony could easily raise without her. It worked exactly as long as her chosen protector kept winning, and it ended the moment he stopped. The diadem she wore into her own mausoleum on the last day of her life had crowned a dynasty of 14 rulers bearing the name Ptolemy across nearly 3 centuries, longer than most kingdoms of the ancient world managed to survive at all. And when Roman soldiers finally lifted her body from that sealed room, it was the last time that particular gold band, knotted at the back of an Egyptian pharaoh's skull, would ever again mean a kingdom that belonged to itself. The mausoleum where she died stood beside the temple of Isis, close enough to the harbour that she would have heard the gulls off the water in her last hours. Octavian had her body embalmed and laid beside Antony's, honouring the request she made in her last sealed letter, the same kind of letter she had been sending to the powerful men of Rome for 20 years, written in her own hand, closed with her own ring. It was the final time that seal meant anything. Egypt became a Roman province within weeks, its grain now feeding Roman cities, its treasury now Octavian's to spend on the city he was about to remake as an empire. Caesarion, 16 years old, and the last king who could claim descent from Alexander through his mother and from Caesar through his father, was killed on Octavian's order before the year was out. The twins she bore to Antony were carried to Rome and raised in the household of the wife their father had left for her. The diadem was never worn again by a ruler of an independent Egypt. The next crown to sit on Alexandria's throne room floor belonged to no one because there was no throne left to put it on. What she had built, alliance by alliance, was never a kingdom that could stand on its own forever. It was time. She had bought Egypt 30 more years of being Egypt, and when the last purchase failed, the harbour lights of Alexandria went on burning for a city that now answered to someone else.